Well, good morning. And it almost sounds like we're singing without masks, doesn't it? That was really quite amazing this morning. It was lovely to hear everyone's voices beginning to fill the room. It's always quite impressive how we may not always be large in number, but we can certainly sing out to the Lord with praise, can't we? And it's lovely as well to have Mark and Cara and Orla with us as well this morning. It's a really special sound, isn't it, when you can hear the sound of a newborn baby in the corner there. So welcome, and we are really thankful because we know how tiring it is during this point. Well, it's great to be back after being away for a couple weekends. Last week, myself and the family, we visited my family in the south of England, and certainly it has been a long time coming. For some of them, it's been at least 2.5 years since we'd actually had a chance to see them. So I'm sure you can imagine, at the beginning we were saying it was a holiday. Now we've got back, we realized it wasn't a holiday at all. It was very much a business trip to go see family and catch up with as many people as possible, which is always really special. And actually, what was really nice as well was I got to go down south and follow the England games with my family in England. And it reminded me a lot of growing up. I grew up during the time where every time we had Euros or the World Cup, we always had massive hopes for the golden generation, the Beckhams and Gerrards and all of that. And sadly, they never did quite deliver on our expectations. But this time, being an England fan, it was actually pretty good. But I hadn't forgotten about Scotland. The England versus Scotland game was a bit awkward, being unsure who it was that you kind of want to win. Secretly, I wanted England to win. But having come in myself from the UK, I've always rooted for England, Wales, and Scotland. In any competition, I will be supporting whoever it is which goes the furthest. And actually, when I was thinking about it, I realized that that's fair enough as well, because I have lived in all three places for a significant amount of time. But when these teams do play together, it does still test your loyalties a little bit. I would be lying if I didn't say that I was rooting more for England when they were playing Scotland than the other way round. And actually, as I go down south to the south of England, if people were asking me where I was going, you might have heard me say that I was going home. It was the home that I grew up in. But also, it turns out that now I have a home in Scotland, which I also call home, and it really starts getting a bit confusing. And actually, I wouldn't trade in the home that I have in Scotland at the moment for a home in England. And yet, I'm still going home when I go home to see my family and my friends. So far, I have lived longer in England than in Scotland or Wales, but that isn't the reason why I think I'll always call it home. Because where we call home, it says a lot about what that place represents to us. It says a lot about the deeply personal relationships that we have with the place, but actually more importantly, the people who are in it, and the memories that that place invokes. A home is somewhere where we should never feel like strangers. It is somewhere where we're always comfortable, where we know that we'll always be loved, that we'll always be accepted. And actually, the Apostle Paul talks about this in his letter to the Ephesians church, where he's talking to the Gentiles, These were a group of people who'd become followers of Christ, but they didn't have the Jewish heritage. And he talks about this in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 19 to 22, where he says, "So now you Gentiles are no longer strangers and foreigners. You are citizens along with all of God's people. You are members of God's family. Together we are his house, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. And the cornerstone is Christ Jesus himself. We are carefully joined together in him, becoming a holy temple for the Lord. Through him, you Gentiles are also being made part of this dwelling where God lives by his Spirit." If we were to imagine or put ourselves in the place of the Gentiles, it must have been so hard to come into a house, to learn to call it their home when it didn't have that history for them. It wasn't historically their own, because Christianity's roots were Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. And although certainly over time Christianity would forge a different path to its Jewish contemporaries who did not recognize Jesus as their Messiah, largely at that time, Jewish people who recognized and accepted Jesus as their Savior, they would have felt at home. They had had years to develop this feeling of belonging. But Gentiles, in some respects, you might imagine that they perhaps would have stuck out like a sore thumb, because they didn't grow up around the customs and festivals which were embedded in the history of Yahweh's people, that is the God of creation. And to be fair, we learn in the New Testament that this was a concern of all the parties involved. Both the Gentiles and the Jews, they were wrestling with the question, how can they make a home together when in some respects they seem so different? But Paul's answer was that your home is in Jesus, the cornerstone of God's house, and that his body is the new temple at the heart of the creation. That it is in God's body, in Jesus' body, that we will find the dwelling place of God's. God's home wasn't about a place or its customs. It was about the promise of participation. Participation for anyone who puts their trust in Jesus. And this has always been the case, and it was promised in Genesis, where God began his plan to be at home with his people. At the beginning of Genesis, I've said this before, there is a theological statement: God created. And it is a fundamental truth of Christianity. But then, as we know, it raises all sorts of questions. God created, but how? But when? Or why? And we don't have time today to unpack all of the different historical and contemporary interpretations of the how or the when. But then, even more important is the why. As God created, as the scriptures start off by telling us God created, why? Why is that important? What is Genesis saying about the why of creation? Almost swallowed my voice then. Well, what's interesting is that for the ancient readers of the Genesis account, the why would not have been that difficult for them to work out. They would only have had to take a very quick and cursory look at the creation story to realize that it is a temple story. And if you look at the Psalms are rich with the interweaving of the language of creation as God's temple. Psalm 104 is a really special example of this, but you'll see it throughout most of the Psalms, this language of creation as temple. But in Psalm 104 it says, "O Lord my God, how great you are. You are robed with honor and majesty. You are dressed in a robe of light. You stretch out the starry curtain of the heaven and lay out the rafters of your home in the rain clouds. You make the clouds your chariot. You ride upon the wings of the wind. The winds are your messengers. Flames of fire are your servants." In the creation story, we see the account of God's creating and then ordering of the cosmos. And then on the seventh day, it is the pièce de résistance. It is the promise of God's dwelling, of his participating within his creation. Day 7 is the reasons for days 1 through to 6. Because on day 7, God rests in his creation. In 6 days, you could say, God built a house. But on the 7th day is when he began to make that house his home, his dwelling place, a sacred place. And the amazing thing is that in Eden, he invited humanity to be a part of his home. The creation story, it is a promise of rest with God. And that word rest, quite often we narrow down its meaning. But actually, it's not necessarily a rest where we're feeling really tired and we just need to sit down and have a nap for a while. The sort of rest where you just crash out, which is what we did when we got back from our holidays. It's actually, when I imagine it, more that kind of rest where you were just content in each other's company. That utter sense of peace, of shalom. That kind of rest that you imagine that you feel when you know that you're at home. When you can just sit and recharge and the time will just fly by. This was the rest that God also promised Adam and Eve. But sadly, they rejected God's plans for them. God invited them to be a part of making his house their home, to fulfill God's promise of an ultimate rest when the work was complete. And you've heard me say this before, when God will say, "Well done, good and trustworthy servant. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." I read a tragic story this week, which I'm sure many of you may also have come across, which really resonated with today's theme. And I always find that amazing when I think you have these God moments, when you have this sense of, wow, this was like the perfect thing which God has witnessed and the Spirit has invoked in me. And you may have seen the story pop up in the news. It's about a man, a property developer, who seemingly sacrificed everything to build a house that he won't get to call his home. It was dubbed as the lighthouse from the saddest ever Grand Designs episode. And if you've seen this, then you might have noticed that this lighthouse is going up for sale for 10 million. That is an incredible amount of money, isn't it? And it's taken almost 10 years for him to have built the house. And the cost the couple that put into it was so much money that they're actually going to have to sell it before they've had a chance even to move into it. It's not even quite finished yet, but they've put it on the market, ready for as soon as it finished. If you imagine at the start, this was the dream home. This was the childhood dreams, apparently, of the husband. He dreamt about this since he was a little boy. And with his wife and his two daughters, he embarked on this project. They bought this piece of land. They demolished the 1950s house that was on it, keeping this beautiful lighthouse. And then they set out to build this absolutely mammoth project. But sadly, this build, it became an obsession. And it put a massive strain on the marriage of the couple. And it left it in collapse. The husband said in an interview concerning his marriage that he felt guilt about it, explaining that his ambition and vanity caused the marriage to end. But then he also said, which I think is really interesting, "I'll always be proud to have finished this. I owe it to my family to have a real end result. But the time has come to move on. I will have achieved what I set out to do, never deviating from the plans, and for that I'll always be proud." So whilst I can't comment on the exact details or circumstances around this whole project and how that put attention on the marriage, all I can really go on is observing what the news has decided to show us, the angle that they've come from. I still do wonder that with his final statement, when he talks about, "I owe it to my family, I will have achieved what I set out to do," I do wonder whether at some point in the future, he may look back and think about whether he really did achieve what he set out to do. Because in the end, he has literally built a house, but not a home. In fact, you could say that he's built a house at the neglect of his home. And isn't that tragic? And for me, that really captured the story of the tragedy of Eden. Because God invited Adam and Eve to build a home in relationship with him, in participation with him. But they rejected God's idea of this home. And instead they pursued their own ideas, their own ambitions, their own vanity project. And sadly, since that time, like the Gentiles found when they were first coming into Christianity, into that community, we will, at some time in our life, all of us experience the feeling of being a stranger, when we just want to feel like we are at home. We saw this perhaps more recently when we consider the England football team, going back to England again, where the young players who were so much hope for the nation, they later received an awful amount of abuse and alienation. This is not the kind of home that God intended. And yet, even when God has seen what can happen when we embark on our own vanity projects, he never gave up. He always persisted in trying to allow us to enter into that home that he has imagined for us, the home where we will never feel like strangers. And when I think about that, and I think about, well, what is the kind of home that God intended? Because it's not what I think the project of the Grand Designs Lighthouse is pointing to. Perhaps we can get a bit of a glimpse of that when we think about that after God looked at his creation, at his house, he said it was very good. But what makes it good? Well, God intended creation as a place of deep relation. And perhaps the reason why when he looked on creation and that he thought it was very good was because it is the dwelling place that he intended where such relation is possible. That it is the perfect environment for the potential of the kind of relationships that God wants us to be in, to make a home within. I came across a quote from an author called Michael Lodahl, who I think explains this really well. He said, "If you consider that the best possible world is one that best suits God's purposes of establishing real covenantal relationship with us, complete with the freedom and risks that entails, with the realities of struggle and pain and the growth those enable, then perhaps this world comes awfully close." You see, the creation story and subsequently the rest of the scriptures, they point to the promise and yearning of relational love. This is a love which actively seeks and probes to know us, to really know us. It's a sort of love that despite Adam and Eve rejecting God's plan for a home, God actively pursued his people anyway. We see this as we look at the construction of the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a dim representation of the kind of dwelling place that God intended for us. It was a place that God gave in grace as a way that God's people can meet God. And the construction of the tabernacle, it echoed the creation story. The final inauguration was over 7 days. And then at the end of the 7 days, God promised, "I will meet the people of Israel there in the place made holy by my glorious presence. Yes, I will consecrate the tabernacle and the altar, and I will consecrate Aaron and his sons to serve me as priests. Then I will live among the people of Israel and be their God. And they will know that I am the Lord their God. I am the one who brought them out of the land of Egypt so that I could live among them. I am the Lord their God." To really know someone is to engage in a deep and meaningful relationship with them. It's a participatory relationship, one which is transforming. And this transforming, probing love that God offers to his people, it's celebrated in the Psalms, where they sing, "O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord." In seeking to know us, God is at work cleansing and renewing us. It is a gracious pouring out of his presence to satisfy his desire to dwell with his people. Since creation, God has been building a home. And it's not just a home for himself, but it's a home for his people. The reason why I think the grand design story of the lighthouse is so sad and tragic, the reason why I saw, just looking out here, so many people's just really clear black and white reactions to it, is that it tugs at the heartstrings, at that basic longing that we all have to enter into a loving home. This place where we won't ever feel like a stranger. And creation points to this promise of a home. And as I said before, the tabernacle, the temple, they were dim previews of what it means to dwell in the house of the Lord, to be present with God. It was a signpost, which is what Paul was saying to the Gentiles. It was a signpost to the cornerstone of God's house. To Jesus, who said, "Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. There is more than enough room in my Father's home. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I will come and get you, so that you will always be with me where I am." It is on the cross that Jesus prepared a place for us in God's home. And on the cross, he demonstrated what it means to offer this grace-filled hospitality. The kind of hospitality where no one is a stranger. It is through the cross that Jesus promises that when everything is ready, he will come and get us so that we will be with him. It is on the cross that Jesus demonstrated just how much God desires that we dwell in his home. How since creation, God has been relentlessly working out his plan to be at home with his people. It is in Jesus, which is what Paul was saying to the Jews and the Gentiles, to everyone, that we can begin to experience today God's promise of eternal rest. Where it says, or is described in Revelation, where eventually God's home is now among his people. He will live with them and they will be his people. God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things are gone forever. That is still the not yet, but it's also in breaking now. God invites us in Jesus to begin to experience the fruits of this promise, and then to witness this into the communities where we belong. Home is where the heart is, which is a well-known saying, and it recognizes that what we call home is not most often about the material things, but it's about the things which tug at our hearts, about the things which really stir us. Well, the Bible reveals that our true home has been prepared for us. We don't need to embark on a £1 million project in search of the home that we thought we've always wanted. Instead, God, in Jesus, has already prepared that home for us, the home that we need. And we are able to enter into this home when we commit our hearts to a person, to Jesus Christ. And that in his body, in his church, in his world, that we will through that then all be witnessing what it means to be participating in God, in God's Spirit. As we just draw today's sort of session or preaching sermon to a close, then maybe we could take a minute just to imagine what if here in our small corner of Dunfermline, we did something really big that demonstrated, that affirmed that God's creation best suits God's purposes of developing real relationships. Imagine if we were to come alongside people and help them to name that longing that they have for a home. To help them realize that that longing is a longing which can be satisfied in Christ. And to be a part of that amazing opportunity to come alongside people as they respond to that call of Jesus in their lives. Because that is our calling. It is our mission. And God's creation, which he pronounced is very good, is the place where this is possible. And I think in order for us to do that, then it's really important we don't deny the needs of the world, its aches and pains, when God views it so highly. This week, on Wednesday, we're going to be meeting at, what time are we meeting for the Liturgicum? 11. We'll be meeting at 11 o'clock on Wednesday to go out into the community, to be praying for the community, to be participating in a real life relationship with God. But also we'll be demonstrating in actions by using it as an opportunity to also go around and help clean up the community. Hopefully demonstrating in that we practice what we believe. That we want to show through the way that we treat the community what our priorities are. That we want to engage in meaningful relationships where people are at. And I'd really just encourage that if you are available to come along. This is the first time that we've done this. We've been doing the prayer walk. I say we, Anne and I know Louise and others have been doing the prayer walk now for a few months. But I really feel that to go through and do a bit of litter picking whilst we do this, it's a real outward demonstration of what we're praying for in some respects. And maybe in doing that, then we might be able to give a glimpse of the reality that we do value the creation that God has given us. And we value people in that creation, and that we want to come alongside them. And we want to help them see and follow and receive that calling that Jesus has given them to come and enter into God's home, to take that place that he's prepared for them. So before we come and we accept Jesus' invite to his table, this might be a good point to see what the children have been up to, who have been really good, haven't they? They've been very good back there. So maybe if they wanted to come up and show us what they've been working on, that would be fantastic. Finn, I'm going to grab the other microphone. Good. So you can take your mask off because then people can see your mouth moving as well. So what have you been working on?
So we made houses that felt like home.
Ah, so you've made a house. So could you tell us what are the parts which make it feel like a home for you?
Because it's got the orcas.
Oh, it's got the occals. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, anything else? Who's that?
Yeah.
Was it me?
That's
Okay.
me sleeping in bed.
Oh, that's you sleeping in bed. Okay. And is that Isla and Mummy, or?
Yeah, that's I.
So why have you got the people in it? Would the house be like a home without the people?
No.
No. There, that's the answer I was looking for. We got there eventually, didn't we? And what about Isla? What have you got? Oh, she can take the microphone herself. Oh, brilliant. And it looks like as well, you've drawn different people in the different rooms as well, haven't you? Yeah, brilliant. Well, they have done a fantastic job of trying to wrap up this sermon because they're way more cuter than me. But they followed the instructions exactly, because first they drew a house, but then they then drew what makes that house a home. And that is really the most basic thing of the story of the dwelling place. And that's what Genesis says. God created, and I'm building a home. And I think if we look at Genesis, when we come to the table, there you go, you can take that back. And I think that is the why of creation. And really, it's quite amazing that God invites us to be a part of that home. Thank you very much. And